All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Good morning to everyone on the panel. Good evening to those of you in the US, and good day to everyone else who's joining us from around the globe. I'm Chris Larson, state senator here in Wisconsin, ACYPL alum, went to Croatia and Hungary back in 2017. Also had the pleasure of hosting Anika Wells and her Aussie counterparts back in 2018. And thank you to her and the rest of the panel, who I'll introduce in just a moment, and to those in the audience for attending who are looking forward to hearing your questions. Last week, ACYPL discussed the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic in the Rundown Down Under Town Hall, focusing entirely on the pandemic. We heard from representatives from both New Zealand and Australia, including Anika, on the successes and challenges the governments of each country were facing in dealing with the crisis. Though we are more than a year removed from that discussion and 21 months into this pandemic, a lot has changed. The pandemic persists, and I'm looking forward to hearing from leaders from both countries about the current situation, but more importantly, what lessons have been learned by political leadership and where we go from here. If you're joining us on Zoom, feel free to write questions in the chat at any time, and I'll do my best to get through those. We have some pre-asked questions we'll get to, but I think it's always more fun if people have things on the fly, make it more interactive if something is happening right now. You can also use your raise your hand feature, and we should have somebody be able to call on you. Anika Wells is a Labour Party member of the Australian House of Representatives in the division of Lilley in Queensland. Chris Bishop is a National Party List MP and the COVID-19 spokesperson for the National Party in the New Zealand Parliament. And Melanie Gibbons is a Liberal Party member of the Parliament of New South Wales, representing Halsworthy. So welcome to everybody. Jumping right in, vaccinations and lockdowns. Like pretty much every country in the world other than China, Australia and New Zealand both have moved away from the zero COVID strategy, and both countries have recently eased restrictions. So I'm curious what benchmarks were hit that prompted the easing of these restrictions, and how do you see the uninvited guest of Omicron affecting the progress made in these areas? If we can go to Anika, then Chris.
All right, fingers crossed this works. Sing out if the connection is not good in the chat. I'm here in the great state of Queensland, which has no peer, but often gets compared to the state of Florida in America, if that gives you a vague sense of what it's like. And we have only had 7 deaths due to COVID the entire pandemic. So we take pride in the way that the leadership here has handled the pandemic, and they have taken an extremely cautious approach. It's very drop the net, lock everything down, and then act cautiously out. And Queenslanders have overwhelmingly endorsed that approach. The state government was returned with a bigger majority in October, sort of about 6 months into the pandemic last year. We recently just opened the state back up because we've had the borders shut for nearly 200 days. We did that on Monday because we had reached an 80% double vaccination rate in the state. And we are actually the most vax hesitant state in the nation. So we are the most hesitant, and we reached 80% on Monday. So that was the trigger. And we are now experiencing open borders and Omicron, which is making for a very interesting mix this week. Hang on a second. So shall we, I would say that we've had a positive experience as much as you can have a positive experience in a pandemic. This is Oshin. And he's a COVID baby, he's actually a quarantine twin, the other twins down here, a quarantine twin. And moving forward, I think my side of the parliament, which is currently in opposition in our national parliament, very much looking keenly at what the Biden administration is doing in terms of building back better, investing in infrastructure. So I would be keen from anybody to share any kind of wins or losses out of that approach so far across the course of our discussion this morning.
Awesome, thank you, Anika. Good to meet one of the twins in person, finally. Chris, do you want to chime in and what's happening in New Zealand?
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks to ACYPL for having me. It's great to be back and talking with friends. I'm speaking to you from my office in Wellington. Parliament's just finished for the year in Wellington this year. We go back in February, so we've got the long break coming up, and I think everyone in New Zealand is looking forward to a break. It's been quite a tough year for us with COVID. We started the year, as you said, running an elimination strategy. We had no COVID, and we enjoyed a pretty good summer at the start of this year. And then Delta arrived it actually first turned up in April into our quarantine facilities, but then escaped into the community in August. And since then, we've had to fundamentally change the approach away from elimination and towards, vigorous suppression or containment or whatever synonym you want to use, but coping with COVID in the community. Our vaccination campaign started very slowly at the start of the year, and I'm the opposition COVID spokesperson, so I'm trying to be fair in my comments, but we were pretty critical of the slowness of the vaccine rollout. And when Delta arrived in New Zealand in August, just 20% of New Zealand was fully vaccinated, and so Auckland went into a very hard lockdown. It's our biggest city, our commercial capital. 1.5 million people went into what we called a level 4 lockdown. So basically couldn't leave your house unless you're an essential worker. And that's been really hard. Those restrictions have been loosened and lifted in the last couple of weeks, but really tough for Auckland and really tough on the economy as well. We have just literally yesterday hit 90% double vaccination in the whole country. Auckland is 93 or 94% of the eligible population, 12 plus. The whole country has just ticked over 90%. There are pockets of vaccine hesitancy and pockets and sort of smaller communities, particularly in rural areas, that are sort of 80 to 85, but the whole country on average is at 90. And so we have just introduced what we call the traffic light system, where basically if you're fully vaccinated, you can live life normally. And if you're not vaccinated, then you're subject to greater restrictions on what, going into cafes and restaurants, getting a haircut, things like that. So the big question for 2022 is how long will things like vaccine mandates and vaccine passes be needed in a very highly vaccinated population, particularly with potentially children aged 5 to 11 starting to be vaccinated, probably first quarter next year, which will, drive up herd immunity. So that's the real question for next year. But yeah, the threshold for us was, basically 85 to 90%, and that is what we've got to. And we're starting to see restrictions loosen, and that's a good thing. I think everyone in New Zealand is looking forward to a good summer. Although having said that, it's now raining in Wellington, so
Excellent. I just have a follow-up question because we are there's a lot of talk of vaccine passports in the U.S. We don't have them unless you're traveling internationally, and very rarely. So I'm curious of how that's enforced for those living under the green light, as you put it. What does that look like?
So I can show you on my phone the government. So that is literally what it looks like. It's like a QR code. It's just in my Apple Wallet thing. Mm-hmm. Everyone's had to get their COVID vaccine records out of the cloud through the government IT Ministry of Health database, and then download a very simple pass. You just have to show it when you go to a cafe, go to a haircut, like concerts and festivals. We'll be using them over summer. It's pretty big in New Zealand over summer. But it's been pretty controversial, to be honest. It's sort of inimical to the traditional Kiwi, and I would say probably Australian notions of freedom of association and movement and things like that. So been reasonably controversial, but on the other hand, 90% of people are fully vaccinated. So for a lot of people, it's like, well, I'm fully vaccinated. Happy to use the pass. No dramas for me. So yeah, but we'll work through that as we go through next year. It'll be interesting to see how it goes.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Chris, and thank you for sharing that. Melanie, I'm curious of what is happening in New South Wales and what the Parliament is up to deal with Omicron.
Absolutely. Well, funnily enough, if you asked that question a week ago, it would be a very different answer. It's really hitting us right now. Our cases have gone from, well, an average of sort of 200 a day to 800 yesterday to 800 the day before to 1,300 yesterday of COVID cases. but 150 of those at the moment are Omicron. So look, it's happening, and it's happening fast, but it's changing. But at the same time, we're easing more and more of our restrictions in New South Wales, because we've hit that 80%, then the 90% vaccination target, and we're on track to hit 95% double dose really any day now. So that's made a difference for us. We're able to get out and about, relatively safely again, because we've now got those high vaccination rates. So that's made a huge difference. For New South Wales, that we've got 8 million people. We have had 640 deaths from COVID over the past 2 years or so. My electorate was one of the first hit. I have a very multicultural electorate, so getting that message out about how to stay home, how to stay safe, how to look after your family, how to stay in your own family bubble was quite a big issue. For our multicultural communities, family is extended family. Stay with your family meant maybe go to 7 households, where we were saying stay within the 1. So just that slight change of terminology has helped to keep us safe. But as I said, we hit 80% back at the start of November. So we started easing restrictions. We also have the QR code, check into cafes, check into hairdressers. As of yesterday, we've reduced the places that's needed. So we're phasing that out to an extent to places where we've found a higher degree of transmission. So you no longer really need it to come into my office to see me, although I'd still like it so we can track. We had a lot of security issues that the Parliament had to face over those QR codes. We've passed legislation to say that they can only be used for tracking COVID transmission. They can't be used by the police to track criminal activity. They can't be used in any other way, except for going back and looking where you've been if you're a COVID positive case, or sending you a text message to say someone who is COVID positive has been in your area. So that's, or not in your area, but been where you were in that shopping centre or whatnot. So it's been a difficult 18 months for my area. We've been at the epicentre, I think, of pretty much the whole country. We have been one of the 3 greatest hit areas and longest hit areas. We've had the most restrictions. Curfews have been introduced. They're incredibly unpopular, and I'm hoping to never see them again. But they made a difference. Getting that vaccination rate up while asking people to stay at home showed the importance of looking after each other and having a community effort to reduce that level of COVID. And it's worked. And now we've just got to make sure that people understand that whilst we are easing restrictions, we still need to be incredibly careful, particularly with Christmas around the corner.
Absolutely. Well, that is, being able to have 95% is pretty astonishing. 95% vaccination rates. So kudos.
We're on our way.
Kudos to you. Yeah.
Well, look, it happened because we were hit so fast and hard that we had to put in measures in place to get that vaccination rate up. So some of them were, trying to get people's work was, the ability to work in some occupations. You had to be vaccinated in order to reduce that transmission, and it wasn't popular, but it's meant that we're all able to live much more safely now, which is important.
Yeah. So jumping back to Anika, followed by Chris, I'm curious about the hesitancy vaccinations, and it doesn't sound like there's a great source of people pushing hesitancy, but I'm curious if there is, and if there was, and how you were able to overcome that. And of course, Ashi and Dash are certainly welcome to chime in if they have thoughts on the topic too, Anika.
Yeah, I think it has been an issue, but it is an issue of a very vocal and small minority. As best as the data can track, we think that obviously, the stats say 10 of Australians approximately have chosen not to get vaxxed at this point. And I would imagine Melanie would have more to talk about by way of her experiences, because it's the enforcement comes at a state level. So it is the state MPs who, I mean, I've had, not myself because I'm a federal MP, but the state MPs in my area, their offices have been vandalised, etc., by people about our passport rules kick in tomorrow. So we're 24 hours out from knowing sort of what that experience is going to look like. I think we have had difficulties in the vaccine rollout at a federal level. You know, I'm wearing my partisan hat as a member of the opposition, but I think you could say that there was, back in March, a advice came in about AstraZeneca that it shouldn't be, that it wasn't recommended for people under a certain age. The Prime Minister, Health Minister and Chief Health Officer chose to have a 7:30 p.m. press conference. So it was like a late night press conference after the news to announce that. And that triggered a huge amount of hesitancy about that particular vaccine, AstraZeneca, and in a way that, you know, no one could even tell you what flu shot you get each winter, what brand that is, you know, but what it triggered was this sort of people were being very discerning about what type of vaccine they wanted, and they didn't want AstraZeneca because of this sort of warning about blood clotting, which is a very small risk. And that, I think, delayed the vaccine rollout, both not just because of supply, but because of that issue, that comms issue that we all then had as public officials, trying to give people there weren't additional health risks. So I think that's probably the number one mistake that I'd point to that made things difficult. Also, I think if you look around the world, places like France, Argentina, I don't know, Chris, what you thought about New Zealand, but they had really strong national ad campaigns, and ours came quite late and was sort of universally panned. So that didn't assist either. But I think I saw you raise your eyebrows and we all gave our vax rates, Chris. We have, as a collective nation, actually got...
Oh, I think we lost Anika.
Got ourselves to very high national vax rates.
Excellent, excellent. We got 90% of what you said, Anika, right at the end there. So thank you for giving us your numbers and hitting that. Chris, curious of your thoughts on Anika kind of gave you props for the rollout of the national campaign on vaccination. So I'm curious of what the hesitancy is like there and what your opinion is of it. And I think you're in the opposition party over there too.
Yeah, and look, it's been funny, to be honest, watching Anthony Albanese and the Australian Labor Party opposition in Australia make very similar critiques of the federal Australian government as we have in of the New Zealand government here, even though obviously I'm from the National Party, which is the equivalent of the Australian Liberal Party. We've had very similar critiques around the speed of the rollout and the lack of proper planning and campaigns and things like that. And literally, there's been a couple of stories which you could literally write word for word and just swap out the party names in the news. For example, not starting negotiations with Pfizer, who is our major supply contractor here, until well after many other countries have done, which is a critique that the ALP has made of the federal Liberal government in Australia as well. So, I mean, here we just started too late. We just started too slow. The hesitancy has been, and that has played into the hesitancy a little bit. So, because we started quite later than many other countries and started quite slowly, that allowed time for hesitancy to build amongst some people. So it's definitely an issue, but I don't want to kind of overstate it, because at the end of the day, 9 in 10 eligible people have gone and been vaccinated. We didn't have any issues to do with AstraZeneca, so it is definitely true what Anika said around blood clotting in Australia, and I've got friends and family in Australia who I know have talked to me about that press conference and how it was a real issue. Here we made the decision back in February, basically, that we would just use Pfizer. So the New Zealand government went all in on Pfizer, and just bought Pfizer as basically a single supplier. Just in the last few weeks, they've rolled out Astra, but you have to really basically show that you need it. Like you basically have to rock up to a GP and say, look, I don't believe in mRNA technology for whatever reason. I want something else. And then AstraZeneca is available, or you don't like Pfizer as a company because there's a conspiracy theory going around about, whatever. So you can get Astra, and possibly next year, Johnson & Johnson will be available. We've also purchased that, although we haven't got any supply at the moment. But yeah, the Pfizer thing has made the rollout quite easy to do because it's just one, supply, one supply chain, and everyone's geared up for that. I think that there is people say a lot of things about mRNA technology, and that's definitely, some people are hesitant about it. But at the end of the day, 9 in 10 people have gone and done it, and so that's been a good thing. There's a bit of stuff on social media that I think seems to have really affected our Indigenous community. So Maori, who are the Indigenous people of New Zealand, they have lower vaccination rates compared to Europeans. And again, that's been one of the points of critique for us from opposition, is the government hasn't done a good enough job at working with Maori health providers and grassroots, on the ground health practitioners to really get into those communities. So there is hesitancy amongst them, particularly younger Maori, that the rates are quite low there. And again, I think, the campaigns, they're like government. The government-run ad campaigns, right? They're never going to be particularly amazing. You need, they should have, involved, people who actually know what they're doing. So yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you, Chris. Anika, I see your hand is up, and I can't tell if that was Ossian jumping in or if you have something to add.
No, that was the boys, I'm afraid. But I'm really interested in hearing Chris's experience. And because, like he says, same but different.
Awesome. Excellent. That is definitely some core and twin action if they are able to know how to put hands up on Zoom already. That is some great online learning. Melanie, I'm curious, because there's always a divergence between what government leaders, what political leaders are thinking and wanting to do, and where the public is at. And so coming out of a 4-month lockdown, and as Anika said, you are at the front lines of putting forward the vaccine requirements and making those work. I'm curious of what your impressions have been of the difference between where government leaders are at and where the public is at, and how those are settled right now in real time.
Oh, Anika's right in that there was confusion, and as we were focusing on that AstraZeneca, an Australian-made vaccination, being able to, we were all hoping for that to be the answer. And as soon as the idea that AstraZeneca had an issue behind it, everybody stopped and waited for Pfizer. And we had supply chain issues, obviously, with Pfizer. We then had, the benefit also of Pfizer is that you can get your booster shot much earlier than what you could with the AstraZeneca. So everybody wanted Pfizer. When there was, delays in being able to get it, it made it quite stressful for a lot of people, and it slowed down that process. As soon as that was explained and eased, it became much easier. We also had to prioritize Pfizer, obviously, to the areas that needed to have a booster shot quicker. So my area of Southwest Sydney got those booster shots, got Pfizer because we could get the booster shot sooner and become safer quicker. Which meant a lot of regional areas didn't get their vaccinations as quickly, and there was a little bit of segregation that was felt by our community at that point, where the politicians were just trying to keep the people who were at the most risk safe as quickly as possible. So that was an interesting difference between what the population wanted and what the politicians thought was needed. Pardon me. The other one was police presence in Southwest Sydney. It was portrayed as the police coming in to fine everybody, to make them go home, and to bring in that force. But reality, 800 conversations over a weekend from the police explaining do you know that there are stay home orders in place? Do you understand them? What do you need? Do you need food support? Do you need financial support? And 3 fines issued in my area that weekend out of those 800 conversations. So, the media commentary, so therefore public perception versus what the government were actually doing, once again, were slightly different. But our focus, look, obviously on keeping people safe, trying to get people to be able to get back to work, or to be able to work from home, trying to get kids back to school as possible was an interesting one. We had parents saying, no, kids shouldn't be exposed and going back to school. We had other parents saying, get my kids back to school. That's where they need to learn best. Pardon me. So that was everybody had differing opinions there. One of the things I'm proudest of was that we put a lot of support into our homeless people and our vulnerable, so that people who were living on the streets and were at risk were put into our hotels, because obviously we have no tourism industry right now. So we could provide them with a roof over their head and get some of those supports in place that they wouldn't have been able to access otherwise. So many people are now in more stable accommodation, not those hotels, but in more stable accommodation suitable to them, because those supports were provided whilst they're in those hotels. So that's been a nice positive that's come out of having that that ability to talk to people, because we had the time to do that, and the focus on being able to get them off the street. But the main focus was on trying to provide people with a financial support. So trying to be able to pay their bills, get mortgage relief, get rental relief. We offered, between Commonwealth and state, a $750 a week payment, so that people could still provide for their families. So, it wasn't a case of you can't go to work, you're left without support. That support was pretty easily available to most people who had a downturn in their work, or another payment for their workplace, so that they could continue to keep paying their staff as well. So lots of different supports in place that helped, but obviously everybody had a different experience during COVID from other people. Southwest Sydney had a different experience to rural New South Wales, or Australia out. Anika and I had different experiences between Queensland being quite safe throughout the pandemic, and that must have been frustrating for them because they're living quite normally, but our borders were closed between Queensland and New South Wales. So, we have a priority on trying to get people back to see their families around the country. We're one country, but our borders were closed across states. So that's been a challenge as well. But we just want to keep people safe, and the population has been quite good with coming along with us, and finding that middle ground. They can see we're getting there. So that's helped a lot.
That is good. Just trying to keep people safe. I think that's a good mantra to keep going with throughout this. Of course, you and Anika are coming up on elections. I'm curious if we could jump to Chris first to talk about what it was like to campaign through a pandemic. So what are the things that you learned campaigning in 2020? What things came up unexpected, and what things could you part on in advice to your counterparts over in Australia?
Oh, it was bloody horrible, to be honest. And we had an election scheduled for September last year, and if you go back to the start of 2020, I think people would have said, fair observers would have said we had a decent chance of winning it. First term government, I won't bore you with all the details, but sort of 50-50 play, might win, might not, but it's going to be a competitive election. And then just the whole of politics became about COVID throughout 2020. I was our transport spokesperson, spent a lot of time on very highly developed and excellent transport policy, which no one wanted to talk about or pay any attention to, so that was depressing. But just the whole election became about COVID, and I don't think that'll be the case from now on, but certainly in 2020 it was in New Zealand, and we got thumped at the election. Our seats in the Parliament's 120 seat legislature, we went from 58 down to 33, got completely annihilated. just on the back of COVID. So, and the government got immense credit for, doing a good job of essentially eliminating COVID out of New Zealand. The election was set for September, ended up being delayed by a month till mid-October because there was another outbreak in Auckland. And so Auckland went into a lockdown. And so it was felt that with Auckland in lockdown, people couldn't campaign properly. So the election was delayed a month. I sometimes wonder whether or not that actually helped or hindered us. I think probably on balance, we called for the delay, but I think actually it probably actually hurt us rather than helped us. It was another month of talking about COVID. So yeah, I mean, it was tough. Like you couldn't door knock. That's traditional way of reaching voters is go and knock on their doors with a big cast of thousands, or not thousands, but whatever volunteers you can muster up. People didn't want to have their doors knocked on. You couldn't do rallies and events, couldn't do public meetings. Even delivering letters and leaflets to people was a bit hard. Because back sort of a year ago, people thought you could get COVID from touching stuff. You basically can't. There's been like one case of fomite transmission in the entire world, but people thought you could. People were really scared about it, so you couldn't really deliver stuff. It's hard to get volunteers to do things. It was just awful, to be honest. Not an experience I even want to repeat. And then we lost the election in a complete landslide, so that was awful as well. So yeah, 2020 was not a good year. I think, Australia and New Zealand politics are different, but they're similar in lots of ways. I think next year will be, I know there's an Australian federal election in Q1, right? Sort of maybe March, April, May. My sense is that both New Zealand and Australia are kind of moving on from COVID being the centerpiece of everything. And if you look at New Zealand's, what's the number one issue facing New Zealand, those polls that people do, COVID's, important, but actually at the moment it's the economy, housing, and law and order, which are traditionally what elections are fought on, right? So I don't know what it's like in Australia. I'll throw over to Melanie or Anika, but my sense is in New Zealand, the conversation's moving away from COVID a bit towards more traditional bread and butter type political issues.
Thank you for reliving that, Chris. And I could tell in the tone of your voice that it was not a fun trip down memory lane of going through that again. But yeah, thank you for the transition too. I am curious, Melanie and Anika, of if you've started campaigning and if that is true, if the issues have changed, or if it is still COVID 1, 2, 3, and then maybe other issues are 4, 5, 6. So I'm curious of what people are interested on and what you guys are talking about.
I'll jump in if you want, Melanie. So my margin, federal seats in Australia are about 110,000 voters. I know it's about 750,000 for American congressional districts, so you must laugh at our piddly little 110,000 seats, but it's a lot to ask. And my margin in my 110,000 voter seat is 1,229 votes. So I never stopped campaigning. I have done 63 mobile offices this term, including a couple of Zoom ones where Brisbane, which is my city in Queensland, was living free, but I was in quarantine after travelling to Canberra for Parliament. So they put me on a laptop at a table at a cafe, and then people came to the table and talked to me with a coffee at the cafe. So we're not anticipating having to do that. Hang on a second. With this election, but I think what I was trying to say before I got cut off earlier was that I think the issue around vax hesitancy ties into a decline in trust and faith in public institutions, things like the churches who had all kinds of scandals in the past decade, politicians, and the issue of integrity and corruption has loomed very large over the top of COVID and across this parliamentary term. A particular debate that is happening at a national level is the introduction of a National Integrity Commission, whether or not that happens, what that model looks like. And I think the experience of vax hesitant people demonstrate just how far trust in public institutions has declined and why that's important. Because if you go and have one-on-one conversations people just say, well, I just don't believe you. Like, I don't believe that you have my best intentions at heart. I don't believe that the government is acting in the national interest or the state interest. Whatever particular theory they subscribe to, what underpins it is a lack of faith that people in elected office are acting in good faith and with the best intent. So I think that's going to be an issue over and above COVID at the federal election next year, and particularly what models and options different parties outline to fix that problem. And I think, like I sort of touched on a little bit earlier, the Build Back Better strategy from the Biden administration, the two parties of government here in Australia are starting to outline what the pandemic recovery looks like and sort of what alternate visions of Australia the public can choose from at the election. And I guess ultimately the question of what the economic recovery looks like that drives those things. And we've got a fresh set of numbers. The Treasurer should be standing up in an hour with those today, and that will really set the economic landscape for the coming election. So more to come, I think, Chris.
Excellent. Melanie?
Yeah, we do have a federal election coming up, March, April, May, somewhere around then, which has been quite an interesting thing to watch that get ready. State-wise, we don't have an election until March 2023, which really isn't long away when you think really we've just lost 18 months or 2 years of our 4-year term of proper campaigning. Like Anika, we don't stop, we keep going, but COVID made it a different thing. It made us, I guess, be a lot more social media savvy, a lot more Zoom meetings and a lot more focus on how to get our community together on this style, town hall meetings on Zoom and Facebook and what have you. So that was an interesting change. It allowed us to get out to a lot of people, but in a completely different style. We have just had a council election. We're waiting for the results of our council elections to come back in across New South Wales for local government. The Electoral Commissioner decided that we couldn't hand out our usual how to vote cards, telling people this is how we would like you to preference the candidates. We had to wear them instead pinned to us because we weren't allowed to actually hand them out. So we were showing them to people, which sort of meant that we got closer to people than what his intention was. So I don't think that will continue on into the next federal election or state election. It became quite a confusing thing. And look, in my area, we had polling booths that had a quarter of their votes were informal because they didn't have something to show how to actually vote and what to do. So that's really sad. We've got compulsory voting, people have to go, and yet a quarter of those votes meant nothing. So that needs to be changed, but from the Electoral Commissioner. But look, we continue to try and get out to our populations and explain to them what we're about. I think Anika's, when she said, do politicians have our best interests at heart? There's some people that absolutely know that they do, and other people that are completely doubting us. I've never felt quite that extreme before. There's that middle ground has gone. You either support your local politician and what they're doing, or you don't. So that's changed over particularly over the last, the 4-month lockdown. People who were very agitated and wanting to get out, or wanting to not be vaccinated, versus those who just wanted to, to do it the safer way. So that's kept us going. But in the meantime, we're just talking about how to get people's lives back up and running again. We're bouncing back. We're not building back, we're bouncing back in New South Wales. And funnily enough, our economic indicators are showing better than ever. We're recovering really, really well, and that's giving people a great deal of stability. Christmas spending is going well. People are feeling confident again, which has made a real difference. We've hopefully gotten through it. Omicron, whether it happens or not, hopefully it's not as impactful as what Delta was, and that we can get on with living our lives again and being with each other and seeing each other and spending and helping the economy again. We're focusing a lot on getting that economy back up and running, projects, building rail lines, building infrastructure, and building parks, so that we've all learnt that we love our environment, we love living in our local areas. So we're focusing a lot on building parks and getting people back into work again, building those. Yeah.
That's fantastic. That's good. I think that's wildly interesting to think about the inherent trust in government and the trust in politicians or lack thereof at a time of crisis, rather than talking about the individual projects and the individual pieces that you usually add as bullet points to the flyers. So it's it kind of makes us think, especially talking here from ACYPL, about the existential crisis of some countries and democracies and how everyone's kind of dealing with that. But taking a few steps back and talking just about labor and the economy, obviously there's that balance there as everyone kind of had a pause, business leaders, workers alike, as they're trying to figure out what to do. So I'm curious, Chris, what are the most important lessons you learned in terms of how to balance the need for government to keep people safe and healthy and the need to try and keep the economy of New Zealand moving? And how have your views evolved on this, if at all, over the course of this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, the government here adopted the approach that the best economic response was a strong health response, and that has proven to be correct. So, a lot of people, when we went into lockdown last year to get rid of COVID back in March, April last year, said, "Oh, this is going to be disastrous. You're going to kill the economy. Everyone's going to lose their jobs, health prices, etc., etc." But it worked. We got rid of COVID. GDP was down for the quarter, but then it bounced straight back up. 15% the next quarter after that. And there's been various international surveys, and on a international basis, New Zealand's enjoyed more days of freedoms than almost in any other country. That has started to change a bit this year. And we've been quite critical of some of what we would regard as unnecessary restrictions on small business trading, for example, cafes, hospitality, things like that. So, for example, for most of the last 6 months in Auckland, hospitality has either been closed or has only allowed seated diners up to 25 people. Stupid things like they haven't been allowed to make use of outdoor seating, which is just an insane rule, because basically, if you're outside, COVID can't really spread outside. It's just things like that. So the debate has been around the margins of restrictions that are having we would argue a cost without, costs that don't, the benefits don't outweigh the costs of doing things like that. So that is where the debate has kind of turned to. The fiscal impact has been quite stark on the government. So, like a lot of countries, and like Australia, I think we had essentially a form of wage subsidy. So government said, you can't go to work. So government just stepped in and picked up the tab for wage costs for business. That obviously, we spent billions and billions of dollars. That was all borrowed money. So government debt has doubled, but it's still very low as a percentage of GDP. I think I was looking the other day, I think we're up to about 55-60% of GDP is government debt. We entered the pandemic, I think, from memory, at about 24 to 25. So still very low by international standards. And in New Zealand, both major political parties have been committed to running budget surpluses and getting debt down, and getting debt down for the rainy day. Well, the rainy day arrived. COVID arrived, and international pandemic, and you've got to borrow your way through it. And I think the question for the next 2 years for us as a country, but also for us in our political party, is what does normal fiscal policy look like for the next 2 years, and what do the voters expect as well? Because New Zealanders have become quite used to and quite liking actually a large amount of government spending, and that's a challenge for a centre-right political party like us, which is generally in favour of lower levels of spending and keeping money in people's back pockets rather than the government. So that is going to produce, I think, some quite difficult philosophical but also practical debates for the centre-right of politics. No doubt Melanie's probably thinking about the same things, I suspect.
Yeah, that's Chris, you continue to do my job for me. I'll kick it over to Melanie to talk about your what your thoughts are on what's happened around Hallworthy's business community and what steps have been taken by the government to keep business afloat.
Yeah, thank you. You know, it's interesting. We were talking about elections and things. The moment people were able to come out of their homes, they still expected the infrastructure to be continuing. So the road projects we were working on, they wanted to keep being built. You know, train station, car parks, they were progressed. Our hospital upgrade progressed. So it was good that we encouraged those kinds of jobs to be able to keep going, so that when we did come out of our homes, the world continued on and we had some hope to come back out to. But it also meant that those jobs kept our economy going, so that it will be a more positive place into the future as well. So that was important, infrastructure-wise. We've also locally, the government's put in about, statewide, the government's put in about a $3 billion package to support our economy, which means locally everybody is receiving now 6 what we call Dine and Discover vouchers, which are $25 vouchers that you can spend either in a cafe, a restaurant, or going to the zoo, going to play 10-pin bowling, going to play golf, or whatever it is you're into. It's getting you back out and about and feeling safe again, and getting people walking back into those businesses again. So they've done really, really well. My local cafes are saying people are giving over that $25 voucher and they're spending about $42 when they do. So it's really helping their businesses to keep going. So that's made a real difference. We've also got vouchers for getting kids back into sport. So active kids vouchers for kids to be able to play football, soccer, go and pay for their dance uniforms, whatever it is, to get them feeling like they can get back into society again and get those businesses up and running again as well. Similarly with swimming lessons, you know, we're Australia, swimming is what we do. We're heading into summer and we've got 2 years worth of kids that don't know how to swim, that haven't been able to do swimming lessons. So we're encouraging them with $100 vouchers to be able to go and partake in those swimming lessons, because we know families have done it tough and they don't have the spare money to be able to focus on those extras. But those extras are what keep our economy going. They keep our swimming centres open, they keep our dance studios open, and keep people employed. So that's been really, really important. Similarly, with the dining sector, spending money, getting our fresco packages to encourage our outdoor dining, because as Chris said, we know that that's a safer place to be. So boosting vouchers to spend if you go into the city, to get people to go back into the city, to spend on tourism, to go and see regional Australia. As I said, when our borders closed, it meant our tourism sector disappeared as well. So we've really been trying to focus on keeping our local economy going, as well as our regional economies across the state as well. So it's, as I said, it's been about a $3 billion package, and it's really making a difference, and it's making people have that extra little bit of cash to spend and to go out and keep people employed.
Excellent. My next question was to shift over to Anika, but it looks like she's busy. So we'll shift back over to you, Chris. About New Zealand's economy grew by 2.8% overall in the second quarter. There's been little relief for the country's tourism and travel sector, which before the pandemic employed 230,000 people, delivered $40.9 billion to the country. So I'm curious, what are the plans to reopen New Zealand in April of 2022 going far? And are the plans to open it by April of 2022 going far enough to address the concerns of the very important tourism industry?
Yeah, I mean, that's been our my big focus for the last few weeks actually has been on trying to get the government to speed up the reopening of New Zealand. I mean, we are a small island nation of 5 million people. We're very dependent on international tourism, but also there's 1 million New Zealanders who live abroad. It's 5 million here. There's 1 million New Zealanders who live in other countries, including hundreds of thousands in Australia, keeping the Australian economy going. New Zealand has been a real hermit kingdom for the last 18 months. basically put the border barriers up in April. We've been running this system of quarantine, or we call it MIQ, Managed Isolation and Quarantine, for the last 18 months. So every traveller to New Zealand up until the last month or so has done 14 days in a hotel, and there's only about 4,000 hotel slots, and basically to get a slot, it's a lottery. So you know, if you're a New Zealander who lives in London, you want to come home for Christmas, you log in every couple of weeks, and you get a virtual place in the queue, and a thing comes up saying your number 27,043, and you wait for an hour as the lottery goes through, and you try and book your spot in a hotel in New Zealand, and that is legally dubious, to be honest, because the New Zealand government has obligations to citizens to be able to return to New Zealand, and it is morally pretty troubling. And look, it made sense when New Zealand had an elimination strategy. So when we were trying to keep COVID out of New Zealand completely, that made sense. It makes no sense now in an environment in which COVID is here in New Zealand and spreading. So we had 85 cases yesterday, 100 the day before that. Very high vaccination rate, so you know, not very many people in hospital, but you know, a lot of cases every day. And the government's pretty upfront about the fact that COVID is now in New Zealand, it's not going away, it's now spreading, and so having very strict borders doesn't make a lot of sense. So to give you the numbers, the number of fully vaccinated travellers from Australia to New Zealand who've tested positive for COVID in New Zealand in the last 3 months is 0. Not a single person has travelled from Australia and subsequently tested positive for COVID if they're fully vaccinated. And yet New Zealanders in Australia, you know, our nearest neighbour, can't come to New Zealand before Christmas without going into MIQ, unless they get an MIQ spot. So our view is very strongly we should be opening up, you know, particularly to Australia right now in the short term. If I'm in New Zealand, if I jump on a plane tonight, this afternoon, and travel to Sydney to go and see Melanie, I think I'm right in saying, Melanie, I'd have to isolate at home for a few days, and I think even that has only changed in the last couple of weeks. Before that, there was no self-isolation period at all. But you know, if Melanie wants to come and see me, she can't do that until April next year, and I just think that is nuts. It's totally nuts. And even then, in April 30 next year, so May actually, even in May next year, Melanie would have to come to New Zealand but isolate at home for a week before being able to go out into the, you know, Wellington community or whatever community. So that's just going to kill tourism. So our view from an opposition point of view is that the government's got the risk proportions wrong at the border now. They're still running an elimination strategy at the border while we're not running that internally in New Zealand. So we're trying to make changes to that. It's don't underestimate the enormous hardship and anguish it's causing Kiwis abroad. There's a court case being led by some expats challenging the border regime in the High Court in January, I think it is. Yeah, it's causing enormous human suffering, and the sooner we can end it, the better.
So that leads to what's probably going to be our final question that came from the audience from Alex. He said, I'm from Mexico, one of the most open countries to travel during the pandemic. What impact, if any, did the tight travel restrictions have on both countries' international image? Was it worth it? And so you've kind of touched on that, Chris, about what the impact has been on the tourism industry. So I'm curious, Anika and Melanie, what if that has changed the image, if you think it's affected the image of Australia internationally while people are not able to travel to your country?
Probably more a question for people outside Australia, what they notice, than those of us in the Iron Fortress looking up. Australia has, you know, traditionally had very hard border policies, so I would imagine this would have been seen as an extension of that. But also, we talked a little bit internally about the states closing borders to each other. That's much more tricky for Melanie and I, because the Tweed River, which divides New Zealand and Queensland, has a whole border community. People will live on one side and cross to the other for their their kids' school and for their work and their business. So that was very difficult to navigate. Whereas Western Australia, on the other side of the country, their border with South Australia is a desert. So a lot less sort of community people trying to traipse the desert day to day. So their border issues were less contentious. On a broader scale, Australia is an island nation, so we never were going to have the same transit difficulty as the European countries when they decided what to do with their borders. You know, when the penny dropped, this was going to be not a week's or a month's, but a years long contention for policymakers to deal with. So I guess I'd be interested more, from your viewers about what they make of us. I think our national leadership would say we have a great success story to tell with respect to the minimal number of deaths that we have had due to COVID compared to other countries. And these policies have assisted that. Chris also makes very salient points about the individual policy decisions taken by governments under our federation structure ram up against each other and can end up quite nonsensical to a punter looking at them with their particular circumstances, even if they're made according to the health advice first and maybe logistical common sense second. Moving forward, I guess because we have this federal election, there will be two alternate proposals about what Australia does moving forward. Chris, I remember last time I told your viewers about the Koala Wars, which Melanie was, the Barilaro saga at your neck of the woods. Last time I did one of these. Let me also break some incredibly important American-Australian alliance news that while we have been on this Zoom, Caroline Kennedy has been announced as the next ambassador to Australia. I am so excited. This is very good news. I was rooting for Secretary Buttigieg, who Chris Larson knows I'm a big fan of, but for some months now it's been looking like Caroline Kennedy. And welcome and congratulations and great decision to you, Chris, and all of your patriots on announcing Caroline as our next ambassador.
It was a group decision on the entire country. Yeah, we're keeping Mayor Pete as Secretary Pete. But yes, we agreed that Caroline will do a good job down under. Yes, thank you to each of you. I think we're on our final minute here. So if we have time to go through, I will say before that we are going to have a survey go out about the town hall sent automatically to those that signed up. So please do fill that out. It helps guide the future of what ACYPL is doing with these. And with that, we can do a round of final thoughts. I think, Melanie, we opened up with you last, so we'll start with you first and then go to Chris and then Anika to finish.
Yeah, look, obviously we've got to see where Omicron takes us. That's going to be an interesting thing. We have a new Premier in New South Wales who's only had the job for, I was going to say a couple of months, but really a couple of weeks. So it's going to be interesting to see how he handles where we go forward. That's going to be something to watch, how Premier Perrottet handles it differently to Premier Berejiklian. But look, I think on that tourism part, we're madly putting now campaigns to say, come to Australia and travel in New South Wales, because we want people to start considering coming back to us. We're a safe place to travel in. And now that we've got our Australians home and our hospitals up to scratch and our quarantine systems organised, that's what we had to focus on, getting our hospitals ready and our quarantine ready so we could get Australians home. Now we can focus again on tourism. So that's an important focus as well. We want people back. Just finally from me, my trip in 2017 to Colorado and Washington with you guys, I actually found out I was pregnant and couldn't tell anybody. So I've handled a lot of these meetings similarly to Anika, with a little one and her 16-month-old, a bigger sister, on two knees. And it's fabulous that we can now have our kids with us as we're working at the same time. It's just changed the way we work, I think, and for the better. So thank you for inviting me along to this. I would love to hear what America's doing and how we can all learn from each other. It's been fabulous to hear about New Zealand as well, because we are as same but different, as Chris said earlier. So it's great to be able to compare and contrast. And if ever we're in this situation again, we've got some more learnings that we didn't have, obviously, from 100 years ago.
Excellent. Thank you, Melanie. Chris, final thoughts?
Firstly, thanks so much for having me on. It's been actually awesome just to connect and participate and to hear from what's going on in New South Wales and up in Queensland from you, Anika. Look, I love Australia. A lot of my friends live in Sydney and Melbourne and Queensland, and I frankly can't wait for the opportunity to visit the great state of New South Wales and the great state of Queensland hopefully in the coming months, and we get that Trans-Tasman tourism started again. Yeah, I mean, it's been a rough year for New Zealand, and everyone here is just looking forward to a break, frankly, and spending time over Christmas and just reconnecting with loved ones. Parliament's just finished here, so we are just in the countdown to Christmas like everybody else. But I reflect really fondly on my time in the States on ACYPL, and still in touch with a lot of people we met on that trip. And it's an amazing organisation, amazing program. So thanks for the opportunity back then, but also the opportunity to be on this town hall as well.
Awesome. Thanks for being here, Chris. Anika, final thoughts?
My final policy thought is that COVID really exposed for us the lack of local manufacturing capacity that we have in Australia. That's something that you do a lot better in the States. It used to be a real source of pride, particularly in regions like mine, and over the past decade or so, local manufacturing has really shut down for a number of reasons. From the very start of the pandemic, where we couldn't get PPE into the country because of the supply chain issues, right through to now where we need to build an mRNA manufacturing facility from scratch and national quarantine facilities because these things don't exist. Clearly, local manufacturing is going to need to be an important policy focus for all states and the Federation next year. And on a personal perspective, technology prevented me from opening with this, but I have such fond memories of Senator Larson taking us around his great state, met us at the airport, took us straight to the baseball. And I remember that your mascot, when your team got a home run, slid down a slide like 20 stories in the air, a metal slide into the bleachers. Amazing, amazing, inspirational stuff for us here in Australia. And obviously, one of the things that we've missed in COVID is the ability for organisations like this to put people like us together in a room, and I can't wait for it to fire back up. And I'm eternally grateful to Chris and ACYP for giving me that opportunity in the first place.
I am glad that you came, and I know Pete is on site and is not on camera and on mute, but we were glad to convert you to be a Brewers fan away from being a Nationals fan. You'll be much happier in the end that way too. Glad
Good memory.
Exactly. With that, we are beyond time, and invitations open to Chris and Melanie to come. Happy to take you to a Brewer game too, if you make your way over to Milwaukee and Wisconsin. So swing on by. Happy to host. But until then, thank you for joining us, and thank you to everybody who was on. Be safe. Good luck with your campaigns, and we'll see you guys soon.